This is the Photography is My Passion podcast, episode 11. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to get proper exposure. Okay, in this episode, we're going to be talking about exposure modes, sometimes called metering modes. And I think it's something that isn't talked about enough. In today's world of photography, we're always talking about gear and we're talking about focus modes and where to focus and how to compose a scene and things like that. But I don't think we talk about exposure enough, mainly because the camera really does a pretty good job of getting exposure. But we should talk about it, and I'll offer you some tips on how you could improve the exposure of your scenes. Now, first of all manufacturers have at least 3 different exposure modes in their camera, or metering modes in their camera. Now, I look at the back of my Nikon D800E, and I see there's a little switch back here, and it shows 3 different metering modes. The first one is spot metering. The next over is average metering, and then next to that is center weighted metering. And we'll start with talking about center weighted metering first. The computer in the camera, what it will do is it will look into the center of the frame, and it will use that information and give it more weight compared to the rest of the frame. So as it evaluates the exposure for a scene, it looks to the center and gives that more priority, let's say, and more say in what the exposure will be compared to everything else around it. Now, there is a menu item in the camera where you could say how big that center spot is. So you can make it relatively large or very, very small. Now, most pros don't like to use that metering mode. Generally speaking, we're not always going to have our subject smack dab in the middle. We might have it to the side or something like that. And we don't want to give the center of our frame more say at what the exposure is going to be for the overall scene. So we usually don't use that mode. Now, the next one over from that is average metering mode. And that will look at the entire scene and evaluate the entire scene equally to come up with an average metering for that scene. Now, sometimes we use that. A lot of times we might have a landscape scene that's mostly mid-tones, not some real bright areas, not some real dark areas, and you could get a really fine exposure using that metering mode. Now, where it could get you in trouble is if you have something very, very bright in the scene, even if it's just a little part. That will skew your exposure over as your camera is looking at that bright side and averaging it in with everything else. So what it will do is it will underexpose your scene because it's seeing that real bright area and trying to make that more middle gray. So it will underexpose your scene. Now, to a lesser extent, if you have something very, very dark in the scene, it will tend to throw off the exposure as well. So it will tend to overexpose in those instances. So we don't use that as often. Now, the last metering mode on the camera, and again, this is on most cameras, is spot metering mode. That means we're using a single spot, and that spot is what the camera is using to gain exposure. Now, on most cameras today, I would say that you could move that spot around, and it's usually, if you're using single point focus, whatever point you use to focus, it will put the metering spot on that focus point. So if you have a frame like this and you're focusing on something here with that focus point, your camera will meter at that spot also. So whatever you're focusing on, the camera is going to use that to gain exposure. Now, not all cameras do that. I have one model Fuji camera, the X100T, and if I remember right, that camera does not do it that way. It always uses the center part of the frame for exposure. Don't like that at all. I'd rather be able to control where in the frame I'm going to gain exposure. Just like I want to use a spot focusing, point focusing to focus on a specific point. I want the control, and that's why most pros like that mode. So we could control where we're focusing, and we could control where we're gaining exposure, where we're going to get exposure from. And again, this could get you in a little trouble too. If you're focusing on something really dark in the scene, then your camera's going to try to make that very dark thing middle gray, so it's going to overexpose the scene. If you're focusing conversely on something very, very bright, it's going to underexpose the scene because it's going to try to make that thing that's very, very bright more towards middle gray, so it will underexpose the scene. But the key is, you know that as a photographer, and you have total control now. If you used center weighted, you wouldn't be able to control where you're getting your exposure from. If you're using average, of course, you're not using any specific point, it's just averaging everything out. So that's why we like to use spot metering, so we could control where we're getting our meter reading from. Now, beyond all that, sometimes your camera will get fooled, and you've got to be smart enough to know when your camera might get fooled by these certain scenes that, you know, whatever. And you could do a few things. Back in the film days, when I was doing a lot of weddings and stuff, seeing as I'm a white guy, I would just use the palm of my hand. And if I took a meter reading off the palm of my hand, it was pretty much towards middle gray, and it would give me a good meter reading for the entire scene, usually. Now, once I became, I guess, a little more successful, a little more sophisticated, I didn't use the palm of my hand anymore, and I would use a gray card. And, you know, most commonly this is used for white balance, but it could be used for exposure as well. You would just have someone in the scene hold this, or if no one's in the scene, just plop it somewhere in the scene, and you would take your meter reading off of this, and this would give you a good average meter reading for the entire scene, usually. And you know, it works out. And you know, sometimes if the scene is really tricky, you would bracket your shots, and you would, you know, bracket your exposures. And usually you would do that. You would keep the same f-stop, and you would bracket your shutter speed, and, you know, hopefully one of those shots in that bracket will be exposed properly. Now, another thing that we could use is a light meter. Now, I know it's kind of in vogue nowadays to not use a light meter. Back in the day, I always had a light meter on, used it all the time for everything. Just recently, I photographed a band. They were in the front of an alleyway, and beyond the alleyway, it was really bright, and there was a church that was perfectly being framed by the alley. Well, not perfectly, but it was being framed by the alley. In the church, the sun was hitting the church, and that was very, very bright. The guys in the band were in the darker part of the alley. They were wearing darker clothes, so it was a real tricky scene to expose. So I used a light meter. You could get an incident reading, that's where the light is hitting this directly, or a reflected reading where it's bouncing off something, and that's what your camera does. It gets reflected light readings. So with this, I was able to get a proper exposure for the scene. Now, more commonly, it's a flash meter. You're using it in, you know, a studio situation, and you're you know, using it with your strobes, or even with you know, your flashes, you know, your camera flashes. Now, again, it's kind of common nowadays. A lot of photographers don't use this at all, and a lot of pretty famous photographers don't use this. I know Joel Grimes doesn't use a meter, and he hasn't forever. Scott Kelby doesn't use a meter, and I don't think he's ever used a meter. And you got to remember, these guys are like the best of the best, you know, so they could get away without using a meter. There's a lot of people that say, well, you don't need a meter, you could just look at the back of your camera because everything's digital nowadays. You know, but in days of film, you had to use a light, you know, a flash meter, because you didn't know exactly what you were getting until you got your film developed. But nowadays, you could just look at the back of your camera. Well, that could fool you too, because you're looking at an LCD screen, and if you look through the menu system of your camera, your LCD has brightness control, has a contrast control, and what if my camera, I have my brightness a little brighter than your camera, and if you're not really in tune to that, you're gonna be either underexposing or overexposing your scene looking at your LCD screen. And again, even if you use the default settings, the default brightness and contrast control in the back of this Nikon camera might be totally different than that of a Canon camera, or even another model Nikon camera, or maybe even another Nikon camera that's the same model. It just might be off a little bit. So I don't think you should use the LCD panel. A while ago, I went to a seminar from a very, very famous photographer who I won't mention, who doesn't use a meter, and he says he always uses the LCD screen of his camera. And it took him a while to get the scene metered right, and without using a meter. He was trying it basically, taking a shot. Okay, that's overexposed. Let's use a smaller aperture. Okay, turn the lights down, whatever he was doing to get proper exposure. It took him maybe 3 or 4 shots, and he thought he had proper exposure. He kept looking at the back of his LCD panel. But when the picture was coming through, he was tethered, and it was coming through these large screen TVs, so we could see it. You could see that he was still overexposed, that the highlights on the model's faces were really blown out. And he probably, from giving the seminar, he's trying to talk, he's not really paying attention as much. And you could see that it was still overexposed. With a meter, he would have nailed it right away. I mean, just take a meter reading. Adjust your lights until you get the aperture you want to use, and you're good to go. And if you use multiple lights too, you might have a key light, an accent light, a secondary light. You have lights for the background. You want those all metered differently. I mean, good luck trying to do that looking at the back of your camera. You definitely need a light meter, a flash meter. And in my studio here, you'll see that right now I have a white background. And recently, I did some shoots and I wanted to clip the people out of the image. So I use a white background. And what I do is with this light meter, this is a Sekonic L478D. There's a little attachment you could buy for it where it becomes a spot meter. And I would put this on and you could look through it like you're looking through a telescope. And I would get a meter reading off the background. And I want that background to be absolute white. And to get even though it's a white background, you have to throw light on it to get it absolute white. And you don't want it so bright, you just don't want to turn your lights all the way up and just blow it out, because then you get something called blowback. And what blowback is when you're lighting the background so brightly, it reflects back onto your subject, and it actually will start to affect the color and the contrast of your subject. So you're getting, light reflected back, and again, they call that blowback. And especially if you have a model with long hair, not a bald guy like me, let's say they have hair that's coming down over their shoulder or something, it will just blow out the hair and it doesn't look right. So you have to be very, very careful that you just don't blow out the background too much. Usually you want it around 2.5 stops brighter than your key light. And 2.5 stops brighter, you'll get a perfectly white background. You could use a white background for that. I could have a gray background back there, a thunder gray background. And all I gotta do is use the spot meter and make sure that I'm metering 2.5 steps brighter than my key light. And that gray background will be perfectly white. So that's, a great way to do it. You need a meter to do it. You could just be there forever trying to guess, adjusting the power of your lights and things like that. Conversely, if you have a gray background, I use a paper, it's called Thunder Gray. If you go 4 steps under your key light, it'll be black. You'll get a totally black background. So a lot of photographers, all they use is a gray background, and they could blow it out, or they could, make it totally white. I shouldn't say blow it out, but they make it perfectly white, or they'll make it totally black, and they just do that by controlling how much light they throw on it. When it's white, they just, again, 2.5 steps over your key light. If it's black, you want it 4 steps under your key light. Now, in those cases, you won't have any light on it at all. What you're doing is you're just moving your subject away from the background enough so that the key lights and any accent lights aren't hitting that background at all. And it's measuring 4 stops under the key light, and then you'll get a totally black background. Now, again, you need a light meter for that. So to kind of wrap up this podcast, what I want you to take away from it is that typically you're going to use spot metering mode on your camera when you're photographing a scene without flashes or anything like that. You're using spot metering mode. But you have to be conscious of what you're metering on. And you know, with most cameras, like in this camera here, I have a button back here to lock metering. So if I have a scene, and in the scene my subject is very bright, but I don't really want to meter off that because it's going to make everything else you know, underexposed. So I want to look through the scene, and I'm looking for something that's more in the middle. I'll focus on that to begin with, and I'll push this metering button back here, and I'll lock the metering in. I have my camera set up, so I press that once, and it will lock the exposure. Then I could come back, focus on what I want to do. I use back button focusing, focus on what I want, compose the scene, and then take the picture. The camera won't try to meter again because I locked the exposure in with that thing that I thought was more towards middle gray, or whatever I thought would make a proper exposure. And you know, that's typically what we do. So you just, you know, you really have full control when you use spot metering. So that's why I encourage you to learn how to use it and try that. After that, don't be afraid to use a light meter. Get to learn incident light and reflected light, how it works. When you're in a studio situation, you could just, like, you know, you want your key light at f11 and just, you know, meter it. You want the exit lights one stop below that, maybe on a hair light or something, and you meter that, you're ready to go. You want to blow out the background, just use this, get a reflected spot meter off that background, and make sure it's 2.5 stops above f11. You're good to go. You could do that before your model even comes in. And your model will stand there, you look really like a professional because you do it right away and nail it. So that's why I encourage you to learn how to use a light meter, a flash meter, you know, and I really think it'll make you a better photographer. All right. So that's it for this episode. I hope that helps. I hope it wasn't too confusing. I know sometimes this metering mode, exposure modes can get a little confusing. In 2 weeks, we'll be doing another podcast. I haven't decided on what subject yet, so if you have any suggestions, email me and let me know, and we'll see if we could do it. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon.